The word grace for me serves as a blanket to put over the mystery that we know as God, to give it shape. So we begin this class every week in a period of mindful, prayerful meditation. So if it helps to close your eyes, do so. Take a deep breath, be here. And may grace be in our heads and in our thinking. Grace be in our eyes and in our seeing. May grace be in our ears and in our speaking. May grace be in the mouth of our speaker today and in his speaking. May grace be in our hearts and in our understanding. And may grace be at our ends and at our departing. And may we be given the freedom and the willingness and the courage to relinquish any modes of living and thinking that prevent our flourishing and our contributing to the flourishing of others. Amen. So I didn't ask you, but please make sure your cell phone is in the stun position or off or silence or whatever. John Howard, last summer, sometime late in the summer, introduced me to a man named Alex McDonald. And Alex and I met, but it was before Thanksgiving. And I got a copy of this book by Alex called How I Learned to Speak Israel. I would let you know that there are going to be copies of this book and other books that Alex has written in the back. And this is a book called How I Learned to Speak Israel. And I read it. And then Alex and I had another meeting. And during that meeting, he said, are you sure you're not Quaker? I told Holly Hudley that, and she said, positively not. You talk too much. So, you know, I thought I knew about this Israel-Gaza thing. This is a copy of the Chronicle that came out before our last meeting, I think it was. And on the third page of the Chronicle, there's a story about how the head of Kincaid School was asked to leave because a student had posted a pro-Gaza placard in the school. It's a hot topic. And I confess, I only know what I have absorbed through the news media about the Israel-Gaza thing. What I knew is that some people from Gaza attacked a party in Israel, and Israel called it their 9/11, and they went after Gaza and blew them up. And then we hear repercussions of that during the news. So I have already been given a bunch of questions by people when they walked in the door written out, and I really thank you for that. I haven't looked at them, but I will, and I hope they're hardball. And Corey is going to be passing out cards and pens in a few seconds. And if you have questions, write them down, pass them to the outside. We'll collect them and I'll collate them. And then before he is through, Alex will answer those questions to everybody's enlightenment. It is a real privilege for me to introduce to you now my friend Alex McDonald. Alex, would you please come forward? Let's welcome him. Thank you. Thank you.
Can you all hear me okay? Yeah, no. How about now? Is that better? All right. I'll have to give up my Quakerdom and speak loudly. We're going to get you more volume. All right. So just want to make sure we'll turn that on in a little bit here. It's great to be here with you all, and good morning. And good morning. I really want to encourage, as Bill mentioned, that you ask have any questions, because I will share with you at the beginning here sort of part of my journey in this discovery about Israel, and to answer the question of the topic today, which is why should we care about Israel, and then I would really like to hear your questions. So again, please raise your hand if you need cards, and we'll try to get them from you. So I grew up in the 60s and 70s. I know I don't look it, and I'm just curious, how many of you all remember the 1972 Olympics, the killing of the Israeli athletes? Okay, great. We're of the same vintage, and the hijacking of airplanes, Palestinians hijacking of airplanes. You all remember that? So that was the environment in which I grew up, and I was very interested in the news and in the messaging, and I remember, hearing about Israel being a land of no people for people of no land. Anybody hear that before? Okay, and that they were always on the defensive, because like the terrorism that we saw in the airplanes and in the Olympics, there were always the '67 war, the '73 war. You all remember the terrorist bombings in the early 2000s in the cafes and the buses? Anybody remember those? Hands? Okay. And so that's the environment in which I grew up. And I didn't really care that much. It was people over there. It wasn't me. And so that's sort of my upbringing. And then in the early 2000s, after these bombings that I just mentioned, I heard on the news that they were building the wall in the West Bank. You all remember when that was started? Yeah? And it was curious because I heard the reporters say they were building the wall in the West Bank. And I thought he must have made a mistake, because my vision was that the Jewish people lived in Israel and the Palestinians were in the West Bank. And it was called a security fence and wall. And I would assume that you would want to put the wall on the border to keep the two groups separate. And so I said, oh, it must have made a mistake. And I went and researched. And I looked up where they were building the wall. And so this first picture here, I hope you all in the back can see it, is this green line, and that's actually the international name for what they call the 67 borders, is supposedly what the international border is. And this red line is where they've built and continued to build the wall. And so you can see how it weaves in, and then this is an early map, but you can even see how it goes all the way out into the West Bank. Here's Jordan in the Jordan River. Here's Jerusalem down here. But you can see how it's just, it picks out large chunks of the West Bank. And so I thought, gee, that's really weird. You're going to have terrorists on both sides of the wall. This is not making any sense. And so I researched some more, and I learned that 20% of Israelis, people who are over here, are Palestinian. And I go, wait a minute. There are 1.5 million bad guys on the wrong side of this fence and wall. This is not making any sense. And so that's sort of what started me on this path of research and discovery and so on. And so what I in trying to understand the situation, I remember in the news hearing about, like I mentioned, these terrorist bombings. And as I was doing this research, I ran across a site that actually had the number of deaths of Israelis and Palestinians over the years. And so here, this is updated till just before October 7th. Everybody here knows about October 7th, 2023. And the red is Palestinian deaths, and the blue are Israeli deaths. And I realized when I saw that graph that I'd never heard this in the media. I'd always seen articles about a Palestinian, a group of Palestinians may have been killed, and then an Israeli killed, and so on. But I had never had any idea of the relative numbers. And I thought, gee, that's really weird. Now, I'm sure people will wonder, well, yeah, but this is before October 7th. What about after October 7th? So, for full disclosure, this is if you include through today. So, all this is that gives you the scale of the previous graph. And then this is October 7th. And then these are, since then, Palestinians and so on. And then these are like the soldiers who have been killed in Gaza. So, and so I thought, well, gee, when I go back to this chart, why is it that, I really hadn't heard much about all these killings, And so I ran across an analysis of the news and the news coverage. And this is from the first Intifada. This is for the year September 2000 to September 2001. So it's a full year of analysis of the New York Times. Okay? And the bold red is the number of Palestinian deaths. The bold blue is the Israeli deaths. Okay? Those are the actual numbers that are recorded. But the news coverages are the thin lines. And you see how, yes, there were more Palestinian deaths reported than Israeli, but sometimes not so. Okay? But it does not at all give you the idea of the scale. And so I understood then why I had misunderstood the situation because of how it was covered. And in looking at it, I go, well, how did they have more coverage than actual deaths? And the answer was they'd have an article about somebody killed, and then they'd have an article about the family or the funeral or some impact. So they would have more than one article about each person, maybe. Not everybody, but some, clearly. And obviously, many, many would be underreported on the Palestinian side. And so that sort of helped me understand that my misunderstanding of the situation was not my ignorance. I mean, it was my ignorance because I didn't know, but that it was more systematic than I understood. And I thought, well, gee, that's interesting. But why is that? So the more I researched, the more I realized that also my understanding of the situation was incorrect because of the language used. And the reason that I entitled my book, How I Learned to Speak Israel, is because I'm calling Israel a language. It's a language that sounds like English. It uses words like democracy, security, defensiveness. But those words in the context of the Israel-Palestinian situation have completely different meanings. And so, for example, when there's the word, who here has heard of the only democracy in the Middle East? Right? It's a state that has never granted the majority of the Palestinians it controls equal rights and self-determination, meaning they can't vote. So today, Israel actually controls the Palestinians in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, but they don't have citizenship. And so that's so it's not so calling it a democracy when you don't allow people to vote is kind of an oxymoron. And then when I looked at the word defensiveness, it controls land that it is taken by force from Syria, the Golan Heights. It's got land, as we all know now today, in Lebanon, but it has had Sheba farms for decades. And then it took Gaza from Egypt. And of course, it took much of the land from the Palestinians back in 1948. So, calling it defensive is kind of a weird definition when it's taken the land by force. So anyway, so as I processed this, I realized that the messaging, how did I come to believe all this and understand? And I came up with this visual. And for those in the back, probably can't read it, but I will just sort of tell you what it's a house of cards. But everything is a story. We are people of stories, right? I mean, the Bible is a story. The United States is a story, right? And like everything else, Israel is a story. And at the top of the story is that it's a Jewish state, right? And what justifies it are these cards below. So that they're victims, that there's the Holocaust, that they've always been persecuted, pogroms and so on. That, again, I mentioned democracy. It's the only democracy in the Middle East. Peace, the next row is peace, security, and defensive. We've talked about that they're always on the defensive. They need, the Jews need their own state because they're always being attacked. And then the bottom row is this anti-Semitism. That's why they need that protection, that they're for equality, that it was a promised land, right? And so, and then of course that it was a land of no people. And so those are the parts that hold up this story that we call Israel, right? Those are the reasons for it and so on. And what I realized is that there are some other cards, and I've put them on the bottom, and they say right of return, refugees, occupation, settlements, apartheid, and blockade. So this is before, I published this book in 2021, so this is before any of this, October 7th and so on. And what I realized is that the cards underneath that stack caused that whole story to collapse. So if you have the right of return of Palestinians that is denied, who are the victims? The Palestinians, right? They're the victims. So that top victim card falls. If there are 6 million Palestinian refugees today, which is recorded, then how could it have been a land of no people? Right? If you have an occupation that's gone on since 1967, how could it be a democracy? Again, who are the victims? They're the people under occupation. And there's clearly not equality. And then as you add the other cards, you can start seeing that these cards on the bottom just make the whole story fall apart. And what I learned in my research is those cards on the bottom are suppressed in the United States. And this is how it really comes down to us. Our State Department will not use the word occupation. Okay? Clearly, they won't use the term genocide. They won't talk about the right of return of Palestinians. And so a lot of our politicians don't either. I mean, we have exceptions. There's Bernie Sanders, bless his heart, who's out there, and a number of others. And more, by the way. But it's, and the media, I've got the documentary that won the award for best documentary last year. I think it was last year. It was No Other Land, which was about.
We showed it here.
Right, and if you look up in the New York Times, they say the full transcript of the acceptance speech, and you listen to it on YouTube, you'll hear a difference. The words occupation and settlement have been removed from the transcript. It's that systematic in our society of the censoring of those terms. And so what I realized is my ignorance wasn't by accident, that this is a systematic effort for us to not know what's going on. And I thought, well, why is that? Why is it such a big deal that we don't know? And the answer is because the U.S. is a requirement for what's happening over there. We provide the military, those bombs, Israel has been the largest recipient of U.S. foreign aid for decades. And Egypt is number 2, and that's only since Egypt has agreed to have a peace treaty with Israel. And so they need us to continue the occupation. They need us to do that. We also, more than half of our vetoes in the Security Council in the last 30 years have been to protect Israel from violations of human rights. And so the bottom line is that's why it's so important for Israel to have U.S. support. And what I concluded from this is they like us to think that the biggest threat to Israel is Hamas or Hezbollah and so on. But it's really us knowing what's going on. Because if we really knew what's being done with our funds, with our political strength, in our name, in effect, then we would be up in arms and say, stop it. And so anyway, so I think it's really important that we as Americans really understand what's going on, understand how we are complicit and actually participants in the genocide in Gaza. Those 2,000-pound bombs that have leveled a place and displaced 2 million people, killed 20,000 children, and those are the ones that were accounted for, is our bombs. We paid for that. And so anyway, so that's what I basically have here, and that's why I think it is important that why we should care about Israel. There are many people who may find things that I've said confusing, and so I would love to entertain some questions, starting and sort of make it open. Bill, is this a good time to do that?
Sure.
Okay. I have another presentation on October 7th. We've done training for Austin Independent School District, and we did a teacher training session on how to teach that. And I could go through that, but I would almost rather make this a little bit more interactive and hear.
So if you have questions that you've written, if you would pass them to the outer aisle, Corey will get them, or somebody will get them and get them to me. So one question is, how, in your opinion, are the bombings and killings of Palestinians any different from those inflicted on Jews by the Nazis? Easy question.
You're right. So first of all, I am a Quaker, so we have the testimony of peace and equality. So I believe killing of civilians, no matter who they are, is a problem. So obviously the Holocaust was horrific, and the killing of civilians there is unacceptable. And so likewise, the killing of Palestinians is unacceptable, just as the killing of Jews and others on October 7th was unacceptable. But I'll expand on the question a little bit, because a lot of people I've heard on the news is, do you condemn October 7th? Who here has heard that on the news? Someone asked, do you condemn October 7th? Right. So it's an interesting technique, because the first thing is we have to understand the context. The context is Gaza has been under occupation since 1967 and has been under a blockade since 2007. So a child who is 18 years, anybody under 18, has never had a full day of electricity in Gaza, because they've been under a blockade that was under Israeli control. And the day after October 7th, and you can prove that they have effective control, that Israel had effective control, because, yeah, it's okay, it doesn't need to be on, thanks. Because the day after, Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, said, we're turning off electricity, stopping all food, stopping all water. You can't do that if you're not in control. So that just shows the occupation. But so the question is defensiveness. So if by international law, if you're under occupation, you are allowed to resist your occupier, right? They have invaded your property. And so if we dissect October 7th, when the Palestinians broke through the fence, okay, was that a problem? No. In fact, 70% of the people in Gaza are refugees whose homes are in Israel. Think about that. The only reason they're not allowed to go to Israel is because Israel says, I deny your right of return. And the only reason they deny the right of return is because your grandmother or grandfather is not Jewish. That's the only reason. So anyway, going through the fence, that's under international law is totally appropriate. Going after the military bases that were there, and even going after soldiers, killing soldiers or kidnapping soldiers, is not against. That's called prisoners of war, right? Because if there's an occupation, by definition, it's a war, right? Now, going after civilians is a completely different story. So I just think it's important to understand those distinctions. And so the question is, what is defensive in that scenario? Does Israel have a right to defend itself? What that really means in that situation is, the question is, do they have a right to continue the oppression and to expand the oppression of the people that they have under occupation? So I'm not saying I'm right, but I'm just trying to open up the perspective a little bit of thinking about what does the context mean. So
I think I didn't understand until I read your book that for 17 years prior to the October event, that Gaza could not export or import anything. And nobody could leave or come in. Is that correct?
So they don't restrict it 100%. They do give permits on occasion, but the permitting process is very restrictive. So, for example, and in my view, it's a little cruel. So they may give permission for a child to go get surgery in Jerusalem at a hospital, but they won't let the parents go with the child, and things of that nature. There was another part to your statement.
Well, that kind of made sense to me, that if you do that at some point, there's going to be an explosion of some kind.
Yeah. So, in fact, one thing when I first wrote the book and I had people read it that I wanted to endorse it, an Israeli read it and he says, "Oh, you haven't included Moshe Dayan's eulogy to Roy Rothberg." And I go, "What are you talking about?" And so Moshe Dayan was defense minister.
The one-eyed guy.
I'm sorry?
Was he the?
Yeah, he was
the one-eyed guy.
The eye patch guy. And he and in 54 or 56, Palestinians ambushed an Israeli settler. And he came to do the eulogy. And my Israeli friend said, it's the Gettysburg Address for Israelis. And it's really interesting. I highly encourage you to look it up. But what it says is, Moshe Dayan says that we can't blame these guys because they see that 8 years ago, their land we've taken over. Okay. He says, but that's why we need to be militarily strong, because they'll always want to have revenge. And so if you think about that, that's in the 50s. That's more than a decade before the 67 war, when Israel took the West Bank and Gaza. That's before the blockade in 2007. Each of these is more and more restrictive. And so that gives sort of the mindset of why they have to be such a strong military.
Are you familiar enough with the Kincaid story to enlighten us about that?
No, but there's somebody in the audience who is, if you want more information on it. Nabila Kinghorn is here, and she is very familiar with it.
I need to give you a microphone if you're going to speak. I'll come back to you, or you can come up here.
And by the way, Nabila and I are part of Interfaith for Middle East Peace. We're a group here in town. We encourage you to find out more a little bit later, but we go to different churches and try to do educational sessions sort of like this as well. And she's Palestinian American. Go ahead.
So I also want to let you know that 2 of Alex's books are for sale at the end of class. If you want, the one that I read, How to Speak Israel, which is really quite good. It's more your personal story about how you came about this. And so they're back there if you want to. So tell us who you are and what your qualifications are, and we're not going to pay you. No.
No.
I'm glad you're here. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Nabila Kinghorn. Kinghorn is a Scottish name, my husband's. I am the daughter of Palestinian refugees that were forced to flee in 1948. They lived in Jerusalem. My father was born in Bethlehem, the birthplace of Jesus Christ. And many people don't know that they're Palestinian Christians, unfortunately, but that's the birthplace of Christianity. And they fled to Damascus. I was born in Damascus and then came to Texas as a very young child and grew up here, so I'm a Texan at heart as well. If I may share one statement from Edward Said, one of the Palestinian scholars, the Palestinians have had to pay for the world's anti-Semitism. You think about that. We had nothing to do with the Holocaust. We were under a British mandate, minding our own business, and my parents were forced to flee with 750,000 other Palestinians. never to return, leaving land and wealth and homes and buildings in Jerusalem. But we put that aside. I am very thankful to be where I am today, and I am very familiar with the Kincaid story because I am intimately related to some of the people involved and have gotten to know the circle. This is the first time that a group of mothers came together and wanted to participate in the cultural fest at Kincaid. And they were Palestinian origin, and they put together a Palestinian booth. They had music, food, henna, all kinds of information, books and posters and so on. And they were very well received. The students loved it, the teachers loved it, many of the parents loved it, and they received second place in the festival, and that was huge. Unfortunately, this year, Israel did not have a booth at this particular festival. And after a few days of euphoria, the you-know-what did the you-know-what, and they were attacked viciously. And the point of contention was a map on one of the posters. And it's a historical map of Palestine, which did exist in 1948. And the story was that it denied the existence of Israel. Well, on the flip side, I bet if there was a map of Israel, it may not have Palestine written in there, but it was a historical delineation of the territory that was Palestine. No intention to make a political statement, to damn anybody, to omit anything, or to be political in the least. Sorry. But unfortunately, this came back to haunt them in a huge way, and it terrified the parents. And they decided to be quiet while the other side raged. And the other side brought in an outside group called Stop Anti-Semitism, which is run by a woman who formed the organization after October 7th. And her claim to fame is that she has a 40% success rate of getting people fired. And who was the scapegoat but this poor man who happened to be the head of school. So that is the story. Their side is left out, the details are left out because they did not want to create any more havoc for themselves or for the school. But there was nothing political intended, no statement was intended, and they just want to be parents with happy students and remain at Kincaid. That's the story. There are no names per se, but a group of parents. And it hit social media in a huge way with this group, Stop Anti-Semitism, and a lot of other social influencers. And this particular group of mothers they got legal advice and they decided to stay quiet and let it just pass.
I would like to build on this whole term anti-Semitism. I've talked about, thank you, Nabila.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
There are. Not only are we complicit, in what's happening over there, but what's happening here is very, very concerning. We know, for example, that presidential candidates have gone in front of AIPAC. Everybody, who here knows about AIPAC? AIPAC is the American Israeli Political Action Committee. And so can you imagine if there were any other country that presidential candidates had to go and almost, curry favor with to get elected? That tells us how compromised our politicians are. But there are laws that are passed on a state level, and they're trying to do it also on a federal level, that limit the conversation. So there's a boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. Who here is familiar with the BDS movement here? So it's Palestinian civil society has said, the peaceful way to end the occupation is to boycott Israel. Just like what happened in South Africa. You all remember the boycott movement for South Africa to end apartheid? So the Palestinians have done the same thing. Well, more than 30 states in the U.S. have passed laws that condemn anti-BDS, that condemn BDS. In other words, if you boycott Israel, then you can't do business with the state. And Texas is one. And I know a lady who is a speech pathologist in Pflugerville near Austin, and she, for her, to renew her contract, had to sign that she would not boycott Israel to teach in Pflugerville. And she's Palestinian American. And she says, I am not going to buy Israeli hummus. And so she ended up losing her job. And she sued the state and won. And there were 5 cases against the Texas. And 2 of them were students who were judges for debating tournaments. And because it was a state school, they had to sign to get paid as judges for debating that they would not boycott Israel. I mean, and it has nothing to do with Israel. And they sued also and won. The state changed the law so that now it has to be $100,000 or at least 10 employees. So basically what it done is it made it really expensive for companies to basically not speak out against Israel. And this is in 30 states across the U.S. And what's happened now is there's a definition of anti-Semitism by a group called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance that is defining anti-Semitism to include criticism of Israel. So that if, and even now, Title VI funding for schools can be affected by that. So if a school, so you take the Kincaid situation, but you take it into a public school environment that gets federal funding, or that they are on pins and needles because they don't want any criticism of Israel because they don't want to lose their funding. And the state legislature just passed a law last year that if a student is found to be anti-Semitic under this definition, that they can be disciplined, which includes, discipline can include expulsion. Thank you. So in terms of hiding that bottom layer of cards in that house of cards, there is a systematic effort in this country to suppress speech. And the Kincaid example is just one of many, many, many people, including Jews, who have been terminated from their jobs. Doctors, journalists, academics, professors, and teachers. And so it's really important that we take that head on, because one of the reasons why we should care about Israel is because we're losing our rights to free speech. Our rights, our democracy is at risk when our politicians are being literally paid by foreign interests. And this association of Israel with Jewishness and wrapping it, I don't use the term anti-Semitism for a number of reasons. One is that there are multiple definitions. And so you don't want, if you want to call it racism, I'm all for that, because I'm against all racism. Bigotry, that's fine. Even if you want to call it anti-Jewish racism, I'm totally fine with calling it that. But and the weird thing too is, if you associate a state that defines itself as a ethno-religious state, which where it gives preferential treatment to one ethno-religious group at the expense of another.
Okay, I got some more.
Okay, go for it.
Why isn't the U.S. government truthful and transparent about this to the American people?
Because there are a number of reasons. One is you've heard about politicians getting primaried, and so they're worried about losing because of the strong lobby and money to politicians. That's one of the biggest reasons. Let's go to the next one.
What's the connection between right-wing Christianity and this movement?
Ooh, that's really yeah. So
You said hardball.
yeah,
So
no, this is great because there are more Christian Zionists than there are Jewish Zionists in this country, and they are very, very powerful. I don't know if you've heard Ambassador Huckabee's statements with interview with Tucker Carlson a couple months ago. Who here heard that interview? It's incredible. Tucker Carlson asked Ambassador Huckabee that and Huckabee is evangelical Christian, if Israel went ahead and took the land, basically, the Nile to the Euphrates, would he have a problem with it? And he said no. I mean, just think about the consequences of that, if it's okay for one group to just take the land of others, what does that mean for international law? What is that? The whole United Nations is irrelevant. So the short answer is we need to be talking with our Christian brothers and sisters and help them realize that that interpretation, and I shouldn't be speaking because I'm Quaker and the Bible is not, I'm not a biblical scholar or authority, but to interpret the Bible that it's okay to be discriminatory, to be racist, I don't think it's what Jesus would stand for. But anyway, so yeah.
one person wants to know if you've read Toa Tishby's book.
No, I've not.
So gives you a great chance to comment on it. So, someone writes, even here in this church, I have seen and heard erasure of Palestine. I've heard pastors pray for Russia, Ukraine, Israel, and a peaceful end to wars. I do hear the word Palestine, but it's rare. Is there an effort within the clergy to decolonize Zionist language and beliefs? I guess I should answer that. I don't know.
Well, I can tell you that a lot of Christian denominations at the top level are adopting positions of against genocide or crime or apartheid and so on. But the problem is often getting that down to the pews, because a lot of people have this understanding that I shared at the beginning of my talk of that worldview. And if you have a whole congregation that sees Palestinians as terrorists and sees Israelis as always being on the defensive, then it's really hard for clergy to talk about Palestinian rights. So that's why it's so important for people to research, and I encourage you all to do so.
In your opinion, how are the bombing and killing of Palestinians any different than those inflicted by Jews on the Nazis?
I thought we did that already, didn't we? Oh.
I'm just reading the question.
Yeah, we did. You already read it to me before.
Oh, okay. What is the difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism?
Oh, this is very important. So, as I mentioned, I don't use the term anti-Semitism because, first of all, A, because it has multiple definitions. B, because Jewish people believe they have the right to define it. So if I have a conversation with someone and then they say, well, no, anti-Semitism includes criticism of Israel, what am I going to say? So that's why, and it's really interesting. I'll tell you a little story. I had a conversation with a rabbi here in town, and he said, well, and he spent 10 minutes describing why he thought that Israel ought to have preferential treatment for Jewish people. And he included things that I knew from my research that weren't true, because there's so much mythology out there. But I don't believe he was lying from his mind. It's just that's what everybody's taught. And so, but I didn't correct him. And I let him finish. And at the end, I said, thank you, Rabbi, for sharing your perspective. I've heard it before from many people. I think I understand it. I said, but as a Quaker, we have the testimony of equality. And therefore, I can't support a state that gives preferential treatment to one at the expense of another. And I said, and by the way, I'm looking for Jews in Houston who stand for equality. Do you know any? And there was silence. And then he said, no, I don't. And I said, I hope that you will give them my contact information if you run across any. And I didn't mean it in a negative way at all. But my point is, I bet you if I'd asked him half an hour before if he discriminates against anybody, he would have said absolutely not. They're Black Lives Matter, gay pride, and so on and so forth. But it's just, all I did was turn the mirror just a little bit. So he looked at it from a slightly different perspective. And so if you use terms like anti-Semitism, you get in a trap. But if you use terms like equality and human rights, then you can have a really good conversation. I was at an event, and big round tables, those, and sitting next to a lady, and she said, "Oh, I don't like that guy because he's anti-Semitic because he supports Palestinians." And by the way, I don't consider myself pro-Palestinian. I'm pro-equality. Because if you're pro anybody and you're against somebody else, so I think it's really important. I'm pro-equality. What are you? That kind of thing. So anyway, this lady says, "Oh, he's pro-Palestinian and so on." And I said, "Well, do you mind using the term racist instead of anti? Because I don't really know what anti-Semitism is." She says, "Yeah, well, he's racist because he's." I said, "Well, I said, the reason that I don't support Israel is because Israel is racist." And I said, "And I understand that you choose to support it, even though it's racist. But I choose not to." And she was totally, it was like the rug had been pulled. Because so much of it is projection. If you use the term anti-Semitism, then you're narrowing the view in one definition of whatever they choose. But if you talk about equality or discrimination, then you can turn the mirror around and say, well, if you're against discrimination, then clearly you ought to be against this. And so answering the question, difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, first of all, if you have to pick out what anti-Semitism is. And second of all, if anti-Zionism is against a Jewish state, what is a Jewish state? If it means, if a Jewish state is one that has Jewish values, I think every state should be a Jewish state. Just like I think every state should be a Christian state. Just like I think every state should be anything that's the good of any religion. But if your definition of a Jewish state is one where one ethno-religious group has privilege at the expense of the human rights of another, then I don't think any state should be that. So it really depends on your definition, and that's how I would answer that question.
That's wonderful. And could you tell the people who are here before we quit, if they leave here and want to do one or two practical things to put into practice what you've talked about today, what would that be?
I would first of all, I'd encourage you to do research, because the more I plug for my books. One of my books is, as Bill mentioned, sort of my evolution. The other one is how to have conversations. So how do you respond to somebody who says, "Do you believe Israel has a right to exist?" And because there's so much, and there are 18 of those. Have conversations. There are organizations that are great, from Amnesty International to Code Pink is one I like. Reach out to me, and I'm happy to connect you with whatever. But the key is to speak out for equality, love your neighbor as yourself, and what are American values. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all people are created equal. Right.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. So you will stay here a minute,
I'll be here.
and there are books back there. If you want them, Corey can help you with that. I appreciate your being here, and you anticipated a smidgen what I'm going to do next week, because I'm going on a text that Jesus says, don't judge. And I remember that the spiritual teacher that I had, I refer to as George, he said, I'm going to give you a principle that if you work with it, it will take you home. And I said, what is that? He said, the principle of equality. Put no one up, no one down. Everybody's on the same plane. So Alex will be here to answer if you want to come up and ask him questions. He will be here to answer those. Thank you for being here. Remember, no matter where you go, no matter what happens this week, you carry precious cargo. So watch your step. See you here next Sunday.
Thank you. Thank you, John.